Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the call today. Before we begin, there are just a few housekeeping points. When joining the internet link, you will have been given the option of joining through your computer's audio or dialing in via the telephone. If you have difficulty connecting to the audio, please message the Centre for Science and Security Studies host using the chat box. On a PC or a laptop, the chat box is to the right-hand side. If you're using a phone or a tablet, you may have to toggle this view to see it. To manage this session, this is all one-way audio. All participants are currently muted, so if you would like to ask a question, please use the question and answer box. If you're using a PC or laptop, the Q&A button is in the bottom of the Zoom screen. Again, if you're using a smartphone or tablet, you may have to toggle this, so please take a quick look now. Please also use the opportunity to ensure that the slides are visible and minimize any features such as participant videos that you may find distracting. I should also note this presentation will use polls. All polls are anonymous, so please do not worry about this when voting. Today's session is on nuclear security culture, where I'm pleased to be joined by two speakers, Dr. Chris Hobbs from the Centre for Science and Security Studies, and Jasmine Auda from the Middle East Scientific Institute for Security in Jordan. The session is planned to last for about 45 minutes, with questions and answers at the end. It is being recorded and will be made available for viewing after the session. At the end of the session, there will also be a short questionnaire for your feedback. This is useful for us to see, firstly, if you like today's session or have any recommendations. Secondly, to include any topics you would like covered or have projects to let us know about projects you would like to share with the community. So, without further delay, today I'm pleased to announce that we're joined by Chris Hobbs. Chris, over to you.
Thanks very much, Carl, and hello everyone. It's really a pleasure to be with you here today to talk about nuclear security culture. So this is one of our major areas of research at CSSS, in particular how security culture manifests itself in different operational environments. And we've been conducting a number of studies, both within UK industry and internationally. However, the job I'm going to be doing today is more setting the scene and introducing the concept of nuclear security culture, its history and its importance. We're going to have some future seminars going to be focused more on the results of the aforementioned studies that I talked about. But yes, as mentioned, the idea is I'm going to set the scene today, and then I'm going to pass over to Jasmine, who's going to talk in more detail about a particular initiative that she's been pursuing, her and her team in Jordan. Next slide, thanks, Helen. So in terms of the agenda for my session, hopefully I'll spend about 20 to 25 minutes or so taking you through this. I wanted to first start by taking a step back and talking about culture more generally, having a look at the different definitions here and its importance in a broader sense. I then want to give a brief history of nuclear security culture, its evolution in nuclear safety, its rise to prominence over the last 10 or 20 years or so. I'm then going to move on to talk about IAEA guidance in this area, in particular the model of nuclear security culture that's been formulated by the IAEA and is now being used by industry around the world. I also want to showcase some of the other guidance tools and resources that now exists in this area. I know we have a number of practitioners that are dialing in. So again, I'm going to give a snapshot of some of that. We've got other resources that you can find either on our website or links to other websites there. And then I want to move on just briefly to look very quickly about nuclear security culture in practice. And here I'm going to give quite a high level view, talking about different international efforts, in particular over the last 10 years, some of the challenges that have been encountered in launching nuclear security culture assessment or enhancement programs, and some of the opportunities that may exist for organizations wanting to develop new programs in this area. Next slide, thanks, Hannah. Okay, so before getting into nuclear security culture, I wanted to just talk about culture more broadly. And here I'm just going to highlight that this is really a contested concept, and it's one that can mean different things to different people. It can also be something that can be quite difficult to define and articulate. And this is really demonstrated by the paper that I've listed on this slide, which acted as a review for over 160 definitions of culture. However, thankfully, and yes, sorry, Hannah, on to the next slide. Okay, and again, as you can saw on that previous paper, while there's all these different definitions and there's no sort of unifying formulation of culture, if you look across these, thankfully there is some agreement as to the key qualities of culture. So firstly, there's this idea that culture goes beyond the individual. So it's a group phenomena, whether that's a national group, a religious group, a generational group, or as we're focusing largely in this presentation, an organizational group. It's something that resides in shared values and beliefs that are generated through shared experiences or history of those particular groups. Secondly, this idea that culture can be a powerful influencer on a group. It can drive and influence behavior, but it does go deeper than this, into more invisible or intangible levels that we'll talk more about later on. And then thirdly, that culture is something which is often deeply embedded within a group. It takes time and effort to change a group's culture. So in terms of its importance, it can be a very useful concept in decrypting the behavior of different groups. So whether that's for use in interpreting what may at first appear surprising actions, or whether it's more broadly understanding why organizations fail or succeed in different areas of their business. And crucially, by developing an understanding of an organization's culture, it may be possible to improve their performance. Next slide, thanks. So now to focus on the issue of culture in the nuclear sector. So it's important, that while nuclear security culture, as I'll comment to later, may be a relatively recent concept, the importance of human factors in nuclear operations is something that has been considered and studied for decades. And here there was really an explosion of work in this area in the 1970s, when it became clear that as human machine systems became more complex and automated, rather than engineering out errors or malfunctions, these could still occur, with accidents being increasingly attributed to human error. Next slide, thanks. And here I've listed, I think, two high-profile accidents, which I think many of us are familiar with, where the cause of these accidents was directly related to the human factor. So the 3 Mile accident in the United States in 1979, and the Chernobyl accident in the mid-1980s in the Soviet Union. So these really showed, the importance of the human factor, how it could break down, and really led to increased focus and work on how the human factor could be turned into a strength within nuclear safety systems. And here I've just included a couple of quotes from the two commissions that were launched into those individual accidents. And you can see here with the highlighting, which I've added, that human beings need to be considered as part of an important safety system. And then for the Chernobyl accident, again, this idea that it's important to try and establish a nuclear safety culture in operating nuclear power plants. So this is where the idea of culture started to come to the fore in the nuclear safety arena. Next slide, thanks, Hannah. Okay. And again, yes, as mentioned, it was really the sort of late 1970s, sort of mid 1980s, when culture became this important concept in the nuclear industry. And again, this actually exploded, this coincided with an explosion of interest in culture, the organizational more generally, from the area of management studies. And here I list one very influential model of organizational culture and leadership, which is the model which is put forward by Edgar Schein, which you can see there on the bottom left-hand side. So again, one of the big values, I think, of this particular model and why it's found such widespread use in the nuclear sector, but also more broadly, is its simplicity and accessibility. So again, because it's so simple, it can be used to study a wide range of organizational phenomena, including safety and security, as we'll come on to. As you can see, what Schein does in this model is it breaks down culture into different levels. So at the sort of visible level, you have artifacts and behaviors, but beneath those, you have these two very powerful influencing levels, basic assumptions and beliefs, how those become espoused values that can be articulated around a broader workforce, with this idea that these two sort of lower invisible or intangible levels play a key influencing role in informing individuals' behavior within an organization. And what you can see here is how this really coincides with the model that was developed for nuclear safety culture by the IAEA, which you can see on the right-hand slide, which is derived from that IAEA safety document there, where again, you can see it's a very, very similar three-level model. Okay, next slide, thanks. So our nuclear safety culture came first. Nuclear security culture was not that far behind. So already by the 1990s, security culture had emerged in high-level discussions in relation to physical protection, and it was increasingly highlighted in relevant international treaties and conventions, as well as IAEA guidance. So for example, in the amendment to the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material, security culture was included in the amendment as a fundamental principle. It was also highlighted in revisions of INSEC 225 on the physical protection of nuclear material, so a key IAEA guidance doc. And it was in 2008 that the IAEA published a dedicated implementing guide on this particular topic that you can see there on the right-hand side. And again, this recognized the fact that the human factor is a key contributor to nuclear security related instances, as well as talking in detail in terms of how that may occur. So again, a few things listed on there in terms of personnel behaviors, as well as broader management processes, leadership, and so on. And we'll go into more detail on that in just a second. Next slide, thanks, Anna. In addition to this sort of high-level recognition of the importance of nuclear security culture, as well as new guidance in this area, there were a number of nuclear instances which involved the theft of nuclear material, sabotage of systems, as well as unauthorized incursions onto nuclear sites that also showed how the human factor can weaken different types of nuclear security system. And again, this is weakening in different ways. So issues in terms of how systems were designed, how systems were operated, how systems were tested, and also how systems were maintained. It also became clear that to be effective, in particular against today's spectrum of different threats, that it's important that security doesn't just fall on the responsibility of, say, the Guard or response force, traditionally responsible for nuclear security, but also involves everyone within an organization. And I would say that's particularly key when it comes to preventative, more personnel-focused measures, and Jasmine is going to talk about that later on in the second half of this presentation. So this idea that, again, security culture, it needs to extend beyond those that are just solely responsible for security to incorporate the active involvement of all staff, even if security is only a small part of their role. Next slide. Thanks, Hannah. And here we have the IAEA, so again, drawn from the previous document that I showed, NSS 7, so Nuclear Security Series number 7 on nuclear security culture. What we have here is an image of the IAEA model of nuclear security culture that you can see on the right-hand side in the IAEA definition. And again, you can see that it also makes reference to the fact that culture is something that goes beyond behavior, so behavior is key. It's a visual manifestation of culture. Beneath that, you have beliefs and attitudes, as well as sort of broader structures that can drive culture in particular organizations. So what the IAEA model does, it lists 30 characteristics of what would be effectively a strong security culture. It also, for those different characteristics, it has a number of indicators, anywhere between 6 and 20 indicators that sort of underpin those characteristics. And it was also based on Eggershein's formalization of organizational culture and leadership. And you can see here the different levels of culture, which I'm going to go into some of in just a moment, but just to describe it briefly, on the right-hand side, so you have personnel behavior. So that's kind of the key level that needs to be influenced. And you have a number of qualities that it can support security at that particular level. But the IAEA model, as Eggershein's model, sort of recognizes the influence of other levels. So fundamental beliefs and attitudes, the importance of leadership behavior in terms of driving how personnel sort of behave, what they consider importance, as well as the influencing effect of different management systems that can be put in place to develop and prioritize security. Next slide, thanks, Hannah. Okay, so again, I just wanted to go through each of these levels in turn, or through most of them. So starting really right at the bottom. So this idea that, you know, one must believe that there is a credible threat to nuclear assets in order to prioritize and action nuclear security appropriately. So here, one thing I would say is that, at least from some of our studies that we've sort of realized, is that it's very important for individuals across all different roles to consider really the full spectrum of threats and how they manifest themselves in different working environments. And here, you know, in terms of our studies, what we've really been looking for are potential disconnects between threat perceptions and how the threat actually manifests itself in reality. And here I just wanted to move to a polling question and to get some of the thoughts, some of your thoughts in terms of how you see the threat, in particular the threat around insiders, and in particular the threat around insiders working cooperatively within an organization. So again, these are employees of an organization that are functioning a role of adversaries looking to do something malicious, whether that's the theft of information, the theft of nuclear material, sabotage of systems, and so on. So again, what do you perceive as the likelihood of these individuals, not just a single insider, but groups of these individuals working together? Okay, and I can see, and again, you can just click on one of these answers. So again, do you see this as highly credible? So again, you know, a relatively high chance that, you know, this can happen, or do you see it at the other end of the spectrum? So not credible at all, or listed as incredible here. Okay, we'll just give that a few minutes, or a few more seconds, I should say. Okay, thanks everyone that's voted. I'll stop the poll there. There'll be an opportunity for some additional polls throughout this presentation. Okay, so the majority of people, so upwards of 40% of people, saw multiple cooperative insiders as something which is highly credible. I mean, the interesting thing about this question is we do see, though, a diversity in viewpoints, because the next most commonly picked answer was the fact that a multiple group of insiders working together was not credible at all. Okay, so we see some real difference in opinion to this question. What I'd like to do now, Hannah, if we could just move to the next slide. And there's a reason why I asked this question worded in the way that it was, because this is a question that has been asked by colleagues at the Belfer Center in Harvard, who asked the same question to facility security managers across a number of countries that had access to Category 1 material. And here are their responses. So you can see here, while for the audience on this particular seminar, this threat was something, the majority of people thought this threat was highly credible. That was actually not the answer that was given by the security managers that took part in this prior study. So the majority of them viewed this threat as incredible, something, or modestly credible, something that was unlikely to happen. And what's interesting about this is if you look at actual empirical studies that have looked across hundreds of insider cases, and here we're not talking just nuclear, but across a range of different industries, you can see some of those results there at the bottom. So again, you know, while not the most common type of insider events, they are something which I would say is relatively common. So occurring in sort of 1 in 5 cases or so, in terms of sort of broader insider-outsider collusion with organized crime or other groups. This occurred in sort of more than 1 in 2 cases. So again, I would sort of identify this as somewhat of a disconnect between how people perceive the threat of cooperative insiders and the reality. So again, it's certainly something which needs to be thought about and needs to be designed into different security systems. Thanks, Hannah. Next slide. Okay, and that was just really talking very briefly about sort of one particular threat. Obviously, there is a lot of others that need to be thought about, as well as sort of thinking about how they may manifest in different operational environments. So moving on to personnel behaviour. So here there's a number of different behaviours that can serve to reinforce security in different organisations. So I've just given an example of one of those that are listed in the IAEA model of vigilance. So this idea that staff should develop a questioning attitude, so they should be trained in what may be suspicious or unusual behaviour. There should also be effective reporting lines, so whether it's to their line manager, whether it's to a third party. This idea that staff are also attentive to detail around this, that again, they'll seek out new guidance when they're uncertain of security significance of a particular action, and so on. So again, this is really just sort of to highlight that, you know, this model is useful, but IAEA guidance, NSS 7, there's a whole host of indicators, relevant indicators behind this that can be used and adapted in different organizations. Next one, thanks, Hannah. So in terms of leadership, so again, you know, this is crucial in changing organizational culture and developing it in a positive manner. And this again is recognized by Shine and others that have studied this phenomenon, this idea that leadership is really intertwined with culture. Here I've just moved on to a couple of security culture indicators taken across these different characteristics because I want to get your thoughts on a particular question, which I'll show in just a moment. And again, these indicators that you can see listed on the left-hand side, this idea of sort of transparency when it comes to nuclear security decision making. So the idea that leaders will explain their decisions with respect to nuclear security, this idea that staff members can feed into these decisions, and there really is an effective two-way communication between the security team and other areas of the business. So Hannah, if we could have the next poll question. Okay, so I'm really interested in getting your thoughts on this. So again, to what extent do you think that staff should be involved, so broader staff outside of the security function, in the development of new security processes and procedures? Okay, thanks. I think we can stop that there, Hannah. Okay, so there's much more consensus around this particular question. So the vast majority of you sort of strongly agree with this statement, although a couple of people do disagree or strongly disagree. So this was a real area of focus for some of the work that we've done in UK industry and internationally. And I think there's been this culture of secrecy, if you like, within the nuclear industry with respect to security, where I think, you know, historically, it hasn't always been the case where security managers have really looked to solicit, you know, a wide range of views when it comes to developing security processes and procedures. And certainly in some of our work, we found that this can really hinder the effective implementation of security because it can lead to the design of procedures that are not necessarily fit for purpose. And if you do that, then staff are going to find ways around those so they can carry out their job. It's this idea of shadow security procedures that can be developed if you do have sort of this disconnect in terms of, you know, procedures which don't necessarily fit with the work that people have to do. So that's interesting. And again, we'll have more on that in a future seminar. Thanks, Anna. Next slide. Okay, so moving on to management systems. So again, I'm not going to go through these in detail because there was a lot of different things that are listed within the IAEA model. But just to say, you know, there is a range of different structures, programs, processes, and procedures that could be put in place to prioritize security. And if you look in detail at the IAEA model, there is a certain emphasis that's placed on demonstrating competency, sort of different individuals in relation to security, and also testing in order to look at the effectiveness of those security systems. Next slide, thanks. Okay, so moving on to assessing nuclear security culture, and Carl's just indicated I'm slightly running out of time here, so I'll go through these slides relatively quickly. Just like I say, there's another IAEA guidance document that's developed explicitly for this aim. Okay, so why do you assess nuclear security culture? Well, ideally, you want to identify where there may be weaknesses in your organization before a serious incident occurs. So I mentioned a number of instances previously, which identified weaknesses in security culture, but this happened retrospectively following that incident. In terms of how you might do this, well, there's a number of different methods that can be employed, and IAEA and others, they recommend using a mix of methods, as different methods will have different strengths and different weaknesses, so they can be very complementary, and I just listed them on that on this slide. And then finally, just a note, I think to do this properly, to sort of go beyond paying lip service to it, it is a fairly involved process. It's something that's going to take, a period at least of several months to do properly, and it's something that's going to have to be repeated over time. Next slide. Thanks. And here, just to highlight, and we'll go into huge detail now, in addition to IAEA guidance, there are a wide range of other relevant tools developed at an international, national, or organizational level. So you've got the WINS, World Institute for Nuclear Security Culture Guide. In the UK, we have a suite of survey tools developed to assess security culture in different industries by the Centre for the Protection of National Infrastructure, Secure. And then at King's, we've been developing a number of resources. These are nuclear security culture playing cards highlighted on the right-hand side, designed to get people thinking about how security culture can be improved. Next slide. Okay, and also just to note, there's been a wide range of international efforts coming from governments and industry in particular over the last 10 years, and I just list some of those on this particular slide. Well, I would say it's still a relatively new area of practice, and there is scope for new studies and new initiatives in this area. Next slide, thanks. So in terms of some of the challenges, speaking very briefly, because I want to give Jasmine some time to talk about her work, I think there has been some challenge in terms of trying to translate some of international guidance into more practical tools, lessons, and approaches. So again, I think it's something that's going to be intrinsic to any sort of relatively sort of new security program. There's been a big push around nuclear security and also nuclear security in recent years. A lot of that stemming from the Nuclear Security Summit process at the highest political decision making level, and a number of countries initiated security culture assessments and new programs as part of that. So again, this idea of hopefully trying to sustain leadership buy-in at the political level, but also within different organizations can be a challenge following the fact that this process has now finished and spotlight has maybe moved to other nuclear aspects. Engaging non-security personnel in security, so again, not traditionally part of their role, so that can create a number of challenges, and again, more on that in future seminars. I think conducting self-assessments can be challenging. So again, ideally you want to use multidisciplinary teams, specialists in some of those different research methods that I mentioned. There's been some work already in this area, but again, it could be expanded. And then also thinking about security culture over a facility's lifestyle. From commissioning to operation to decommissioning, the threats, the challenges, they're going to change over that time. And next slide, Carl. Okay, and finally, in terms of trying to overcome this, so again, we're sort of big believers in the fact that there's a lot can be shared in relation to nuclear security culture relevant programs. So again, increased sharing and dialogue in this area, I think, is important. The idea of using diverse teams and specialists in assessment efforts. There's a lot that can be done, I think, in drawing experience and establishing nuclear safety programs. They have this similar conceptual basis. A lot of the things that can be used to encourage effective nuclear safety culture can also apply to security. And then, as mentioned, I think there is scope for broader sharing of practical lessons from industry in establishing security culture programs. Last slide. Okay, so just finally, culture, I think it's an increasingly vital aspect of nuclear security. There is a wide range of IAEA and other guidance that are now available, though this must be carefully tailored to different organizations to be effective. And there has been a big push over the last 10 years in industry in terms of thinking about security culture, assessing security culture. And this is just the first of many seminars that we'll be doing on this topic. And with that, I'll pass back to Carl and over to Jasmine.
Thanks, Chris. Some really interesting material there. I've got some questions, but I'll save them to the end. So Jasmine, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carl, and thank you, Dr. Hobbs, for your presentation, and to everybody for joining us this morning. As evidenced by my title, my focus will primarily be on nuclear security culture in the Middle East, but I'll have more of an emphasis on the practice as opposed to the concept or history, which I think Dr. Hobbs has given us an excellent introduction to. Next slide, please. So the agenda for my session, I'll start with talking about nuclear security in general in the region, before going on to discuss some of the observations about security culture and the different ways that it can be impacted in the Middle East. And then I'll present Jordan as a kind of case study and my organization's experience in supporting the development of a security culture there. And then I'll end with some of the lessons that we gained from that process and the different challenges and constraints that were encountered. Next slide, please. So we can just go to our intro poll question. Very simply, it would be great to see where everybody is joining us from today. Particularly interested to see if there's anybody from the region. See how relevant this may or may not be. Just a few more seconds. Okay, thank you very much for your time. The majority of the participants happen to be from the region, so I hope that this is instructive for you as well as for everybody else joining. So thank you. Next slide, please. Before we get started with the specifics of nuclear security culture, this needs to be prefaced with the observation that nuclear energy in general, as well as these concepts of nuclear security and culture, are relatively new in the region. We currently have 6 nuclear aspirants, only 2 of which are in operation. The first is Iran, which entered commercial operations in 2013. And the second is the very recent United Arab Emirates, just earlier this month, became the first program in the Arab world to become operational. In terms of the research reactors, however, there's a longer history with Iran and Egypt operating their reactors since the early 60s, as well as a more robust presence with just over 20 research reactors in the region today. As far as the nuclear aspirations are concerned, there are a lot of different motivations and capabilities amongst these countries, and I won't be going into them today, but I just wanted to say that these will all influence what security and security culture will then look like in each respective country. When talking about the current state of nuclear security, I've highlighted a few issues in the region that I think can either directly or indirectly have an impact on security culture. The first is the lack of comprehensive regulatory requirements, and nuclear security is this fragmented framework of various instruments. Some are legally binding, some are voluntary commitments, and there are huge variances in implementation across different countries. The second is the deteriorating risk environment, and this can mean things like political stability, social unrest, international tensions, or even disputes, as well as the presence of non-state actors. And all of these don't really make for an environment that's too conducive for security culture. Next, we have that there are not enough requirements in place to address the human factor. And this can refer more broadly to security culture in general and different frameworks that are in place, but it can also refer specifically to the presence of insider threat mitigation programs. And finally, we have that progress has slowed in recent years, and unfortunately, with the end of the Nuclear Security Summit process, if we're familiar with it, there just hasn't been that much high-level attention given to the issue in recent years. And even though I'm talking about these issues in the context of the region, they're really by no means unique to the Middle East, and there are manifestations of these issues on the global level. If anybody's familiar with the Nuclear Threat Initiative's Nuclear Security Index, the one that was issued earlier this year actually includes all of these issues, in addition to some others, as findings in their assessment of the global nuclear security sphere. So even though some of the issues might perhaps be more acute or pronounced in the region, they're by no means singular to the Middle East. Next slide, please. In terms of security culture in the region, because we don't have this very robust framework for nuclear security or a longer standing nuclear history, this does have an impact on what security culture in the region looks like. And for a lot of the nuclear newcomers in the region, they really will have to build this security culture more or less from the ground up. Now, one way to approach this is to look at what different facets of national organizational culture there are and how these can then have an impact on security culture. For national culture, some of these methods can be somewhat more intuitive. They can also be based on observations or thorough in-depth assessments of a country's history, tradition, societal norms, or any of these other facets of cultural anthropology, such as a country's beliefs or values. And there are some other more concrete or perhaps just more comprehensive measures of national culture. And I've just mentioned them here if anybody's interested to look into them, but I won't be going into them. There's the Hobbs model of national culture, as well as Edward Hall's high context framework. And these look at different indicators, including things like a power distance index, which measures how comfortable a society is and how much it accepts the fact that a hierarchical order may exist within a country. These methods aren't really too definitive or conclusive, but they can help to give this general indication of relevant factors. For organizational culture, there are also a number of different factors that can possibly have an impact on security culture. If a country is looking at building foundations for this security culture, it can look at some characteristics of the industry itself. So for example, if there's been a nuclear regulator or operator already established that will eventually be responsible for the operation or oversight of a given facility, you can look at things like whether or not management has clearly identified and stated what its security expectations are, if it even recognizes security as a strategic risk, and if it does, if there have been any different types of educational programs or trainings rolled out of the facility. If there are no relevant industries that can provide instructive examples, there's this whole field of organizational theory, and Dr. Hobbs touched upon this in his presentation, and this can be looked into to help gauge a general idea of the different dynamics and interactions that could exist within an organization. And then you see how these would impact security culture. Examples could be things like relationships between management and its employees, policies on corrective actions, if there are any reporting frameworks in place. And these are just examples of the different ways in which you can start to get a reading on your security culture and how it can actually play out. Next slide, please. So this is our second poll question here today. And this is just an example of the kinds of assessments that we did in Jordan when we were developing the relevant awareness and training elements to establish security culture at facilities across the country. And there's really no right or wrong answer for this one. It's just, we're just interested to see if there's any consensus on what some of these factors may be. So if you could just take a moment and let us know if there's any factors that you think are perhaps more relevant than the others. Okay, just a few more moments. Okay. Thank you to everybody who responded. I'm interested to see, so a bit surprised to see that it's the accepted practice. Usually what we find is that it's the lack of consistent demonstration by managers. But when we actually did this, when we started to do these kinds of assessments in Jordan, we found that the responses were very much across the board. And this did validate our assessment of the relevant national and organizational practices. So again, it's just an example of the different types of assessments that you can do to come up with these very relevant issues and see how they would then impact your organization. Thank you very much. And we can go to the next slide, Hannah, please. So based on these numerous assessments, we came up with a number of general themes, I guess you can say, that initially were very specific to Jordan, but that I think can also be of some relevance to countries across the region. Because even though there are these wide variances between different countries, there are still, I think, threads of commonalities in things like the political structures and the demographics. The first factor on the national level that we found was that the threat perception can traditionally be very outward-looking. And something like this can have a huge impact on the ability to both recognize and acknowledge the issue of insider threats. Now, whereas this was very relevant for Jordan, this might not necessarily be the case for other countries that have perhaps history or experience with something like intrastate rivalries. The second factor was the over-reliance on the security agencies and armed forces. I think that's very self-explanatory, and what I would imagine is common across a number of countries as well. Next, we have the potential resistance to intrusive screening for civilians. And this really points to the societal perspectives on boundaries and when they may or may not be deemed as acceptable. And finally, the issue of nepotism. And in Jordan, this was traced back to the very tribal nature of the country. But again, for other countries in the region, I think a lot of countries in the Middle East are a lot more collectivist in nature. They're very closely knit, family ties, and these things often present in the professional or organizational spheres as well. On an organizational level, you first have the issue of awareness, which is not always organization-wide and could be just limited to senior management. So even in instances when you do have senior management that very much has the conviction that specific policies are required, their motivations and reasons for doing so may not always be shared with their employees. There's also the belief that security is the responsibility of security personnel. And this ties to the factor on the national level about the over-reliance on the security agencies. And something like this can critically impact security culture, which does necessitate that all employees need to take ownership and responsibility for security. The next one that we found is that experts are constantly engaged in capacity building activities. And this is kind of a mixed blessing because a lot of regional countries are recipients of very generous international support for nuclear security activities. But this can be very disruptive in many ways as well, as you may imagine. And then finally, there are the competing organizational priorities for resources. And this doesn't just refer to financial resources, but also things such as time and even how human resources may be allocated to different activities across an organization. Next slide, please. I'll talk a bit about Jordan and the gradual approach that was implemented to develop a sustainable security culture there. And my organization, which is from outside government, was pretty closely involved with these efforts. And I do need to say that this is relatively unique by regional standards, not just because there's of anything too specific, but because there is a tendency to view these issues through a very hard security lens. And this is something that Dr. Hobbs mentioned as well. He called it a culture of security that exists around the nuclear field in general. So in Jordan, the efforts, just a very high level readout of what they were, they did focus on the first facility in the country's nuclear infrastructure, which was the Jordan Research and Training Reactor. And they involved convening a series of workshops and trainings on a variety of issues such as security, security culture, and insider threats, as well as the development of an interagency task force to develop Jordan's first human reliability program, security awareness courses, refresher trainings, and finally, the establishment of a safety and security awareness raising signage campaign. In a moment, I'll give some background into two of those components, particularly the human reliability program, as well as the signage campaign. But I'll first very briefly talk about the methodology that we employed to develop this framework. Next slide, please. The TRACE methodology is a conceptual basis that was developed by my organization for the establishment of a tailored security culture. And it's not intended to be a step-by-step process or anything, but really just more of a way to structure your thinking and approach to these different issues. I won't go too much into the details of it because it is laid out in one of the reference documents, which is a practical guide for nuclear security practitioners in the Middle East. And we do have it available in English and Arabic for anybody that's interested. So very briefly, we first have totality. And this refers to stakeholders that could either have an interest in or influence on a program. And this is critical to not only creating the sense of ownership that we talked about, but also to factoring in all the different perspectives that may exist. In the region, for example, some of the stakeholders that actually play a really big role in this process include agencies and institutions such as the military, intelligence, and even the guard force that's responsible for protecting these facilities. Next, we have recognition, which is the awareness of the threat. And this means two things. The recognition that absolutely no facility is immune from the possibility of an insider-motivated action, as well as the recognition that systematic measures and policies can actually help to detect and deter potential security breaches. Applicability refers to the legal, regulatory, and even administrative and procedural issues that need to be taken into consideration. And the main concern in this respect is that in order for a sustainable security culture to be established and operate effectively, there needs to be appropriate legal and administrative frameworks and capacities, and I cannot stress this enough, in place to support it. We've already talked a bit about culture, so I won't go into that again, but I just think it's important to point out that culture can still, unfortunately, be very easily overlooked, and that facilities should be strongly encouraged to look into these relevant national and organizational cultural factors. And finally, we have empowerment, and this does tie to recognition as well. And that's about creating an organization-wide sense of ownership for security, which can include things like educating employees about the threat and emphasizing the role that each person can individually play in order to contribute to overall organizational security. Next slide, please. The Human Reliability Program, as I've mentioned, is one of the main components that was developed to establish and maintain a security culture in Jordan. And there's a lot that can be said about a Human Reliability Program or HRPs, so I won't say much about it at all in the interest of time. I'll just say that these types of programs have become a lot more widely formalized and socialized in recent years, but in the region, they do remain a relatively novel concept. These programs can go by other names, such as trustworthiness programs or personnel surety programs, but they're all personnel security programs that seek to ensure the physical and psychological reliability of individuals that work in critical facilities. Next slide, please. The Signage Campaign is the second component that I wanted to just very briefly highlight. And what this is a method of safety and security awareness signage that utilizes a combination of images, messages, and relevant cultural themes. This isn't really a standalone initiative. It's often used in conjunction with other awareness-raising activities or trainings to help promote a sustainable security culture. And it can be really beneficial in not just promoting accountability among staff members, but also serving as kind of a refresher for specific images or messages that management may want to emphasize at any one given point. And finally, it just demonstrates an organization's commitment to actually prioritizing and enhancing security. I'm not sure how clear the examples are here on the right-hand side, but I'll just briefly talk about two of them. So the first one is, the message is security is your responsibility. And what this is, a person in civilian clothing, and underneath you have the gendarmerie uniform. And in Jordan, the gendarmerie is actually the guard force that protects the research reactor. So the main theme that we were trying to promote here was that of accountability and this over-reliance on the security agencies that I mentioned. The second poster I can talk about is the one right underneath, and it says, I can barely see what it says. It says, honoring a guest does not come at the expense of security. And this was one of the main themes that we came up with, and which is hospitality. And I think it's really common in the Middle East, and it unfortunately can have a very negative impact on security culture. So again, we're trying to promote this positive behavior, this professional behavior, and to downplay the issue of hospitality as much as possible. We can go to the next slide, please, Hannah. I'll start to wind down by talking about some of the lessons that were learned in our experience in Jordan, and which could potentially provide some guidance to other regional countries as well. The first one is that of international expertise. And there are a lot of resources and references that are out there that, while obviously very beneficial, can actually be a bit overwhelming as well, because a lot of the recommendations can seem too daunting or prescriptive or sometimes just not that relevant. So it is fine to pick and choose, I think, what may work best for a specific program. And this leads us straight into the second point, which is to avoid modular approaches. As mentioned by Dr. Hobbs, there's an increasing recognition about the need to tailor these things, about the role that culture plays, and that there is no one size fits all. So security culture really does need to be factored in accordance with the specific national and organizational particularities. Next we have is to employ a gradual approach. And this really helps you to ensure that there isn't just acceptance or understanding for any initiatives or programs that you may be introducing, but it very simply allows you to incorporate some of the findings and lessons from each phase into the subsequent phases that you may introduce in a program or facility. Benefit from other ensure objectives are understood, excuse me, and that's just to make sure that all those that are involved in the development or formulation of these frameworks understand what the objectives are, but also all of those will be direct beneficiaries of them. So again, it's this organization-wide acceptance and understanding and recognition of the need for nuclear security culture. Next we have is the benefit from similar programs in other industries. And again, there's no need to reinvent the wheel because of all these resources that are available. The aviation industry is an oft-referenced example of an industry where there are some shared characteristics with the nuclear field. And finally, it's to utilize experiences and lessons learned of in-country incidents. We do this quite often in Jordan, and I think a very recent salient example is that of the current COVID pandemic, for example, because it's brought out a number of outcomes for countries that to elucidate how different structures can operate within a country, what specific response efforts can look like, and even what public acceptance and adherence of introduced measures and policies may be. So even when an incident may be completely unrelated to nuclear, there are still many inferences that can be drawn. Next slide, please. And I'll just end very briefly with talking about some of the challenges and constraints that were encountered. And I won't go too much into detail for these because I think they were alluded to throughout the discussion, but I'll just run through them. You have competing priorities, limited resources, a lack of awareness, required capacities, and this refers to not just the technical capacities, but the administrative ones as well, which I think are often lacking in the region. There's a fear of failure for embarking on these types of initiatives. And finally, the difficulty of measuring or assessing the impact of nuclear security and its related initiatives. There's an interplay between all these different factors, and they can really be an obstacle toward developing a sustainable security culture. And I think in the Middle East in particular, you're contending with a lot of different things, such as a very dynamic and evolving threat, but also things like government inefficiencies, bloated bureaucracies, and sometimes even just shifting national strategies. So the challenge in that sense becomes a lot more formidable. And I didn't intend to end on such a gloomy note, but I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you, Jasmine. That was very, very sort of clear and comprehensive. So no, thank you. And to Chris as well. To the audience, thank you for joining us. If you have any Q&A questions, please use the Q&A box. We're gonna have a short session now. But just in the meantime, I'll use my prerogative. So Chris and Jasmine, one thing I felt between the two of you was perhaps of a role of leadership in this. Chris at the organizational level, and Jasmine, particularly when you mentioned, I think the fragmented nature of regulation around this. So really, I guess my first question is, what can leaders do to help create a more effective nuclear security culture? Either, I think, at the institutional level, or perhaps at the governmental or regulatory level. What can they do to help encourage security culture?
Great. So maybe I'll start on that question. So as I had a slide on this in my presentation, and I went through a couple of things that leaders could do, in particular when it comes to encouraging this sort of two-way communication and thinking about how to develop effective security procedures that sort of complement other operations, so don't impinge on the sort of business side of nuclear operations. So again, yeah, and there's a wide variety of things. So again, at the sort of high level, it relates to assigning appropriate sort of resource and importance to the security function within an organization. So that's at sort of the very top leadership level. And then at different levels sort of beneath that is the idea of sort of leaders acting, in a way that they would want their other staff to in respect to security. So again, not looking, and this can only happen in sort of extreme cases, not looking to bypass any potential, security measures because of their level of importance, but following procedures in the same way that they would expect their teams to do so, prioritizing, assigning rewards in relation to positive security behaviors, while also, administering sort of punishment or punitive measures if people were to break, security procedures. So again, really sort of emphasizing the importance of different measures. So yeah, the organizational level, I think you can have leaders, obviously at the top are very important, but you can have leaders with certain levels of, either formal responsibility or the fact that, you have informal leaders that are looked up to because they're experts at their job or have been around in an organization a long time, and they can also play an important role when it comes to promoting security and security culture.
Thank you, Chris. Jasmine, sorry, any thoughts?
Sure. As you mentioned, Carl, leadership is key to these issues, and I think it's very difficult to have a sustainable and effective security culture if there isn't some sort of high-level buy-in into the need for implementing these different types of frameworks. To echo what Dr. Hobbs said on the, I guess, more national or regulatory level, you do need to find out how applicable anything that you want to introduce will be and how it will be reconciled with the pre-existing laws and regulations. So in Jordan, for example, it's actually one of the few countries in the region, if not the only country, that has a very formalized human reliability program. And that means that there are regulations that exist in place in order to allow for the functioning of such a program. Some countries may implement specific components or measures, but they may not be as formalized. And this can then have an impact on things like how you monitor it, what you do if there are violations or things like that. So it is this issue of applicability that I mentioned. And I think on the institutional level, it's, like I said, you do need this the senior level buy-in, but some of the things that absolutely facilities need to focus on is the issue of capacities. So whenever you're introducing any specific kind of measure, you absolutely need to make sure that the proper administrative and procedural capacities actually exist in order to be able to manage and monitor any of these types of programs.
No, thank you, Jasmine. And I think that probably echoes another point I think which Chris made, which is these are not short-term wins. These are kind of to do a security culture program properly. It's a large investment, and you need to do it over time. So having that capacity, I think really is the bedrock there. It sounds like. Just on a related one. So a question from George. So how would those responsible for nuclear security culture in an establishment protect against the influence of poor external governance or social culture? Is there a way which, I think the poll was quite interesting with the accepted practice. Is there a way in which those responsible can help protect against those sorts of influences?
I think absolutely. I think that's, I'm sorry, Dr. Hobbs.
No, go ahead, Jasmine, please.
So I think that's why I attempted to emphasize the issue of the organizational culture, because you'll always have these external factors that will influence how things may play out at a specific facility or organization. But it essentially, at the end of the day, is the responsibility of a facilities management in order to be able to implement or establish specific kinds of frameworks. So again, it's this issue of how much can a facility do if it isn't reconciled with with a higher level strategic direction, for example. But there are lots of different initiatives that, Dr. Hobbs mentioned, that I talked about, things like different educational programs, trying to set positive examples and just leading by example for senior management in general.
Yeah, thanks, Jasmine. Chris?
I was just going to add that I think, in the UK, we're relatively fortunate in that we have a nuclear regulator that prioritizes security culture. So again, I didn't have time to talk about it on my presentation, but it's one of the fundamental principles in the new SIAPS approach to regulation. So outcome-focused regulation that we've adopted here in the UK for nuclear security. And there's associated regulatory guidance as well to help inform sort of organizations in terms of how they may look to develop these programs. But I appreciate that, and a lot of the other countries that we've perhaps worked in, don't necessarily have this. I think in some ways, internationally, industry has kind of led initiatives on the nuclear security culture side, and even though they're not necessarily required to due to their regulatory commitments. We've done some work here at King's, I think, in terms of how one can paint nuclear security and nuclear security culture as a business enabler. So again, something which can potentially sort of impinge on the bottom line in case this is done correctly. So again, I think even if you're not getting that sort of external regulatory pressure or guidance, one within the security team can paint a picture to sort of senior management in terms of why nuclear security and nuclear security culture is important, and how it can actually, act as something which can drive sort of broader innovation and productivity as well, in terms of getting that organizational culture right within a business with, security as part of that. So there are things that can be done, but again, it can be more challenging if you don't have that, supporting external environment in place.
No, thank you, Chris. I realise we're kind of just past the hour now, so I'm going to ask just 2 more questions, if that's okay. So Chris, one for you. We have a question, I think, relating back to the 3 Mile Island accident. Could you expand a little on how the human factor was related to the 3 Mile incident?
Okay, I'm going to caveat this answer by sort of saying that, the primary focus of my work is really sort of nuclear security as opposed to nuclear safety. So I wouldn't describe myself as an expert, on nuclear safety or this particular case. Nevertheless, as I understand it, just to give some background on the incident, what we're talking about here was something that started as a relatively minor malfunction in the number 2 reactor at 3 Mile Island. So what happened here was a secondary cooling circuit malfunctioned, causing the temperature to rise in the primary coolant in the reactor, and that then led to automatic shutdown of the reactor. Okay, so at this stage, there wasn't it wasn't necessarily a serious incident, but what happened at this point was that one of the relief valves failed to close, and this led to the draining away of the primary coolant, which caused the core to melt. So the key thing here really in terms of the human factor was that this valve, the fact that it hadn't closed wasn't identified. So the operators here were unable to diagnose or respond correctly to this unplanned shutdown of the reactor. And in subsequent investigation, this showed errors when it came to the design of the control room instrumentation. So again, it was difficult because of that design for the operators to actually diagnose that this valve had failed to close. And also the investigation also revealed issues around how operator training had been conducted with regards to how to deal with non-routine or emergency situations. So again, those are some of the, I think, the human factor influences there. There are probably others as well for that incident.
No, thank you, Chris. And I think our last question for the session, Jasmine, to you first, if that's okay. But challenges during COVID, don't think there's any getting away from that in these times, but challenges for education, particularly in these times, are enormous. What has your practice done to overcome and promote nuclear security education in a world of, I guess, remote learning?
So I'll answer just kind of from a regional perspective, and I think the challenges to nuclear security education have long predated the COVID outbreak, unfortunately. Like I said, it is a relatively new concept in the region, and the focus is more often on things like nuclear safety, and even unfortunately for a lot of these countries that are nuclear aspirants, and they've developed a lot of educational programs for nuclear and nuclear engineering. Nuclear security is really not at all factored in, and if it is, it's almost kind of a passing thought. So in terms of trying to promote nuclear security, what we do as an organization is we always just try to promote it from a more practical standpoint. So it's very much professional education for nuclear security. And in that sense, it becomes tailored to specific organizations or goals, and trying to come up along with the stakeholders that work within a given institution, what their needs are based on their own internal assessments. And we then do our best to try and deliver them. Everything so far has been done remotely. I think in terms of, again, these international resources that are available, things like what King's is doing with all these webinars, other organizations such as the World Institute for Nuclear Security, we try to do our part to promote these resources and disseminate them as much as possible.
Thank you, Jasmine. Chris, any thoughts on nuclear education or nuclear security education in these troubled times?
I think I'd like to sort of change the question slightly and talk about more sort of nuclear security during times of COVID. And here I'm going to, more generally, and here I'm just going to plug an upcoming event that we're going to be holding in the early to mid part of September. So this should be a side event to the IAEA General Conference. And that's going to look in particular at how different countries, different organizations are responding, how they're ensuring effective nuclear security given some of the challenges posed by the current pandemic. So that's kind of my quick sort of cop-out answer. And again, referring you to a future event that will go into depth on this. But I guess just briefly, you know, I think already, you know, from some of the research we've been doing on this topic, you know, COVID is throwing up a number of challenges for nuclear security. So obviously there's the move in a lot of cases to working from home, and that's created potential additional vulnerabilities when it comes to information and cybersecurity. So it corresponds as well to a sort of change in threat vector when it comes to sort of cyber criminals and other groups who are, you know, choosing to target, as released in a recent Interpol report, organizations which maybe they would have found challenging, you know, to get access to, but they see a potential vulnerability here in terms of from this move in homes. So I guess in terms of education and training, there needs to be increased sort of awareness of some of these issues around remote working, what types of information can be transmitted and shared across different systems, where previously, you know, working with this really would have been done within the secure confines of the office environment and sort of IT systems in place there. There's also interesting implications, I would say, as well, particularly the longer this crisis goes on in terms of the insider threat that we talked a little bit about in this presentation. So again, there's the potential, you know, for disgruntlement, for some of the psychological issues and strains of remote working under sort of different environments, you know, that may also come to the fore here as well. So I think sort of education and training around these particular threats across different organizations is something which is going to be increasingly important. But again, as sort of mentioned, we're going to go into a lot more detail on that, hopefully in the event next month. So hopefully you can join us for it.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. And Jasmine, thank you both for your time and expertise. That was excellent presentations there. And thank you everyone for attending today's session. I hope you enjoyed it. So after this, we're going to send around a very short survey. So please do take the time to fill it in so we can learn from your thoughts. For those of you who attended the Nuclear Security Culture Programme workshops in London, we really want to see how you're getting on. So as a reminder, we'll be sending surveys, impact surveys out to you periodically. So please do look out for those. But in the meantime, we're looking forward to seeing you at the next webinar. This will be on the 17th of September, where we'll be looking at radiological security. So thank you very much for joining us today and stay safe. See you next time. Thank you.
Okay.